And today we want to look at this third area of decision making. How do we make decisions in the midst of all of this? What we want to look at is how we go about making decisions and what decisions are about. And part of the way to look at this is that a couple of weeks ago, a large congregation I was working with sent me a document that describes their planning process. And if you looked at that document, you'll see that it is a classic strategic planning document. It's a document that basically says, here's our vision, here's our mission, and here are the plans and the strategies that we want. And that's how they're working. That's how they go about making their decisions. And so they sit down at the end of a year as leaders on retreats, and they say, given our vision and mission, where do we want to be at the end of next year? How do we align our systems around it? And we have all of that kind of decision-making process that's going on. And behind it, there are a certain set of assumptions. That these assumptions are how we go about making decisions together. And I would probably imagine that for most of you looking at this, this is a normative pattern. This is the way boards and elders and presbyteries and other things, this is how they make decisions. This is what underlies the agendas that come to the table of most church organizations, whether congregations or regional areas or national areas. Now, behind it, going to the next screen, is an understanding of how the world works. It is a world, we live in a world in which if we know how to read the data, if we know how to gather the information correctly and assemble that information and that data, then we are going to be able to manage, big word these days, and control and predict the outcomes that we want. In other words, what lies behind strategic planning that I'm describing here is this deep conviction about the primacy of human agency. And that if we work well with these skills and capacities and methods, we can begin to shape the outcomes that we want. Now, there are some people who introduce into that all the theories of complexity with feedback loops and all that kind of thing. But underneath it, the process is basically the same. This is the fundamental planning processes that shape most of us in most of our churches. And it's not a process that in any way reflects what it means to be God's people. And so in talking about how we go about decision-making, I want to now bring in and move to another way, a different way of decision-making that's built around God's agency. What is so, to Phil's point, un-Presbyterian about all of this is that they're doing what we call midrash. And what midrash means is, and this would be completely normal for Jewish communities, is they come together like this and they're family, they're community, even though they're disagreeing, and they begin bringing scripture in, telling stories around scripture, but in a, how do I say this correctly? They're also letting scripture mess with them and they're messing with it. And it's back and forth. And what's important here is that these people, they're seeped in this way of being around scripture. And it's not a matter of looking for Bible verses that will reinforce my argument. It's about living inside the richness of the Bible's stories with these other stories. The other part, Andrew, that strikes me, because I think you're right, is that part of what makes this happen is that they trust James.
Yeah.
Right? They trust him. And it's not a formal kind of role trust. To your point, Andrew, you can't overemphasize that this process of decision making is happening in, to use your language, for them, cataclysmic, disruptive times. Luke is writing this through the rearview mirror of AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, the pulling apart of the whole thing. Now, he places this story, obviously, in Jerusalem. But to your point, this is about a people needing to make decisions together in the midst of utterly disruptive space and time. And to me, at least, it's helpful to ask, what are they doing? How are they going about this kind of decision making? And what might that mean for us in terms of where we are? Because sometimes, I mean, you can look at this, that we have learned, and some of you may say, no, that's not us, so please do that. We have learned processes of decision making, which fundamentally was shaped in the industrial age. And they had to do with how to get things done, how to create objectives, and particularly in Western societies, a profound sense that we are in the driver's seat, that we do know what we're doing, and we do know where it's all going. Now, in reality, we may not have known what we're doing, but the point is, that's how we were behaving. And so we have inside us, in our structures, in our bodies, in our common habits, this whole industrial sense of how you go about making things happen. And that's what I described in terms of strategic planning and stuff. And now we tumble into this place of disruption that really, it's got nothing to do with COVID, to be honest with you, but it's a massive disruptive space in which we find ourselves. And those methods of making decisions that we've developed are simply not capable of addressing the space where we are. And so here you have a Jewish community that is shaped, it makes its decisions out of the interactions between text and story, text and story. And in the midst of text and story, this asking the question, what's God doing here? And how then do we listen? And what I find fascinating is that at the end of it, what James says is not, there's no white smoke going up the chimney at the Vatican. It seems good to us. I mean, did you get that? It's not we've made the right decision now and here's what we do. It's after midrash and story and back and forth, it's beginning to emerge that it seems good to us. It's a radically different way of decision making. How might we begin to start embracing this kind of decision making? And part of what I would say is probably the smartest place to begin is with your leadership team. It might be, your board, your elders, whatever. And I want to give you or propose to you kind of a picture or a map of how you might go about doing this. And the first thing to say, which is obvious, and you're all going to see this, is that you cannot most of the time, you cannot quickly change how your boards and your people behave, how they go about making decisions. That's just simply not how we work as human beings. So going into your board and saying, hey, given we're in COVID and given this is a great opportunity for us to blah, blah, blah. Most of the time, that will not be greeted with warm applause and a great about time. It will be greeted by consternation. So this is about how do you start small? How do you begin to find small ways of introducing this way of decision making? And because you see, what we see in Acts 15 are people who are immersed in a particular way of decision making that we're looking at that's natural to them as Jewish communities. It's in their bones. But these are not the defaults that we live in. So to invite a congregation and its leadership into this way of decision making, you've got to think long-term and intermediate term, and you need to begin in small places. So what might that look like? If you begin with your board, you want to do simple things. You want to ask, what might be some quick wins, small experiments in trying out a different way of decision making, where you dwell in scripture, you ask, are there stories that you're experiencing that help us understand what we're dealing with? That's the place to do this. And you might, for example, and some of you are already doing this, begin just a simple task of beginning each board meeting with a dwelling experience. Again, without wearing it out, Acts 16 for us is a key practice. So long as we are reading the text and inviting dwelling. What's going on here? What's happening here? How is Paul making decisions here? And in that dwelling, if you do it regularly each time you meet, invite people into it, you'll discover they'll become comfortable with it, and they will be listening with it, and you can invite discerning questions. The second thing that you want to do is, as you look at the list of action items that are on the agenda of your board or your leadership, and there's going to be quite a few of them, what you might want to do is say, is there one of these action items, a small one, around which I could introduce a different way of making decisions here? So now I can't tell you what that might be. It might be around opening up. It might be around how do we reach some youth, or what do we do with people who aren't coming back, or long lists of things. But then to take that one item and to say, okay, let's listen. And by listening, I mean, as I think about this item, let's take people who are not coming back or haven't been coming back. How do we listen to their stories? What are their stories? As we listen to their stories and we dwell in the word together, what might be the interconnection between these things? And as that conversation goes on, and it doesn't have to be one meeting, it could be over 2 or 3 or 4 meetings, then what are we hearing? What are we discovering? What are we learning here together? And as that goes on, then you can move to what then might be a simple experiment we could try in terms of connecting with, listening to, and engaging those who aren't coming back. And you design a simple experiment. and you invite people on your board to try out that experiment. That could be something as simple as going to have a conversation with some of these people and listening to what they're saying, and then coming back and reflecting. What are we hearing? What's going on? What are we doing? What do we think God is saying in the midst of all of this? So in other words, you take this small element in the overall work of a board, and you begin to focus on a different way of decision-making around that small piece. That's the way I would propose that you think about going about this. The big important piece in this is to use what we call action reflection. It's for you as a leader to keep inviting these people. Say, what did we do? Why did we do that? What worked? What did we discover? What are we learning? What do you think we should do next? That undergirds everything that I've just described, and we can send you more details around this. So that what you're doing is you're beginning with your leadership finds itself. And most leadership these days are pretty anxious about making the right decisions. And you find one small area and you begin to work it, and you do action reflection. So that's how we would go about this. The other important thing is that, and I hear this very often, is that in most boards, the board as a whole just wants to spend its attention on the matters there on the agenda. And so as you identify one small area to experiment with, what you can do is say, would there be a small number of us on the board who would work with me as the pastor and perhaps some other people in the congregation to begin to design a small, simple experiment about how we make decisions here, carry that experiment out, and then report back to you as a board, so that the board doesn't feel like it's being dragooned into some other way of making decisions that it's not used to. My experience is that most members of a board signed on to faithfully carry out the normal work of a board that they've seen happening. And they want to do that, and they want to do it well. But if you start introducing new ways of doing things, they get anxious because they're not used to doing it. And the best way a board can learn new ways of operating is to watch some other people do it. That's what experiments are about. And then to reflect on what they've seen. That gives them the space, the comfort and safe space of not risking themselves, but watching what this is about, talking about it, and allowing it to become inside their own understanding. That's a critical piece in doing this. So you identify a piece, get a small number, you create an experiment, you action reflection with people. So that's a set of recommendations about how potentially to move in your congregation with this kind of way of decision making. And then before we stop and get into conversation, there are some resources that we've created that we want to share with you. And you can connect with these resources through email and through the links that are being done. One of these is a simple assessment process that you can use that helps your leadership team evaluate how it's currently going about making decisions. So one of the most helpful ways in the midst of the dwelling and everything else is to help them look at how are we making decisions. And what we've done is create a very simple assessment that shows different ways of making decisions, strategic planning, that sort of thing, and discerning, and allows people on a board to say, answer a set of questions that shows where most of the time their energies are spent in making decisions. And with that very simple assessment, that enables you to invite them into conversation about, okay, if we're making decisions this way, what might be the other way? So we'll share the links for you to use that and get that. And we'd love to see you do it. And right now, that's about building awareness. Secondly, we also have a resource that's available on our website on how to have a conversation together as a board about decision making. So again, that's another resource that's there for you to do. And then thirdly, we have a resource that we've been sharing with you lots of times, and all of these are just there for you to use, called Leading Out of COVID, which is how to have conversations. Let me put it in a different way, how to do midrash around this decision-making process of COVID. So again, 3 different resources, all doing the same thing, all ways of beginning to create awareness amongst your board members about how we do make decisions. And then some ways of finding small areas to make those decisions. We began this event by talking about the disruptive spaces in which we find ourselves. We've talked about how it's simply not just COVID, but there are deep, basic things going on and changes going on for which the institutions that we've inherited and the leadership forms that we've been shaped in are simply no longer capable of addressing what's going on. So what we're doing is creating what's called a leadership project, which is really for those of us who are saying, you know what, there really isn't going to be a going back to normal. We've got to discover again our calling in this new space. And just encourage you to check out the resource. Go to our website and you'll see there a video and some further information on the leadership project. And we're beginning our first group of people in the leadership project in January. So if you're interested, we just encourage you to take a look at it, get in touch with us, and we'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you, everybody. God's peace, and we will talk again. Take care.